The world is used to seeing power flow in one direction. When the strongest nation speaks, others usually listen. But this time, something different happened. Something no one expected. A moment when a country stood tall, refused to bow, and changed the conversation forever. What if I told you that the most powerful call in the world was made, and it was simply rejected? That pressure, threats, and blackmail didn't work. That one bold decision sent shockwaves through the global order. This is not just politics, it's a turning point. Because behind the headlines, there's a deeper story, a story of courage, of standing firm when the world tells you to bend, of choosing dignity over fear. And that story holds a powerful lesson for every single one of us watching today. In this video, you will discover why this refusal mattered more than a single phone call. You will see how it exposed cracks in the old system of power. And most importantly, you'll learn why this moment is a reminder that strength isn't about size, weapons, or money. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to be controlled. Stay with me until the end, because the final takeaway goes beyond nations, beyond leaders. It's about you, about how one decision, one act of courage can change everything. This is the moment the world realized when pushed too far, even the quietest power can roar. The unexpected moment arrived quietly, yet it carried the weight of history. A call was made from the most powerful office in the world. On the other end, a leader who represented a nation rising fast, no longer content to play second place. The voice on the line was firm, demanding alignment, obedience, and compromise. But what came back was silence, followed by a refusal. It was not rudeness, it was resolve. The world didn't expect it. For decades, the script had always been the same. The United States dictated and others complied. This time, the script was torn apart. That call was more than a conversation. It was a test of strength, of loyalty, and of how far one nation was willing to go to protect its independence. The request was clear: abandon your own interests, cut your ties, and follow America's lead. For smaller countries, the answer might have been quick compliance. But here, the answer was resistance. The refusal was not just about one issue. It was about principle. It was about saying enough is enough. America's pressure game is not new. For decades, it has been the backbone of its foreign policy. Sanctions here, warnings there, the threat of losing access to markets or weapons or support. This strategy worked for years. Nations that were too weak to resist gave in, even when it went against their own interests. Fear was the tool, and control was the reward. But the world has changed. A new reality is taking shape. India's decision to stand firm revealed this change in the clearest way. The U.S. expected compliance, but what it received was a message: no more blackmail, no more submission. This wasn't just defiance for the sake of defiance. It was a calculated stand, a refusal to let outside pressure dictate national policy. It was a signal that India was no longer playing the role of a junior partner. It was stepping into the arena as an equal. This moment unsettled Washington because it shattered an old habit. For years, American leaders assumed that when they pushed, the world would bend. When they issued demands, those demands would be met. The refusal from India was more than a rejection of one call. It was a rejection of an entire approach. It was the first sign that the old game was ending and a new game was beginning. What made this moment so powerful was not just the act of saying no, but the calmness with which it was done. No loud threats, no heated exchanges, just a steady refusal to compromise the nation's interests. That calmness carried more strength than any argument could. It was the calmness of a country confident in its position, secure in its choices, and unwilling to trade dignity for favors. Behind this decision was also a recognition of history. India had seen how nations that surrendered to pressure often ended up weaker, dependent, and stripped of their own voice. To avoid that fate, it had to chart a different course. And by doing so, it revealed a truth that many had forgotten. The ability to say no is one of the greatest powers a nation or a person can have. The unexpected moment was not only about international politics, it was a reflection of human nature. When someone powerful tries to impose their will, most people submit out of fear. But those who stand their ground change the balance instantly. By refusing, India forced the U.S. to reevaluate. By rejecting pressure, it flipped the script. What was once seen as dominance now looked like desperation. This is why the moment matters so much. It wasn't just about trade, energy, or diplomacy. It was about dignity. It was about reminding the world that no amount of threats can overpower a nation or a person that knows its worth. And when that realization takes hold, everything changes. India's bold stand came at a time when the world least expected it. The pressure was heavy, the stakes were high, and the eyes of global powers were fixed on the decision. In moments like these, hesitation often creeps in. Leaders calculate, weigh risks, and sometimes fold under the weight of consequences. But this time, there was no pause. India stood firm. No hesitation, no compromise. The answer was clear, direct, and unwavering. It was not just a political decision, it was a declaration that the days of bowing to foreign pressure were over. This stand carried a unique power because it came from confidence, not arrogance. India was not shouting, not grandstanding, but calmly asserting its right to decide for itself. That calm defiance spoke louder than any speech could. It told the world that India would no longer be cornered into choices that weakened its future. It told Washington that partnership could no longer be mistaken for obedience. It told everyone watching that the balance of power was shifting. Why was the U.S. shocked? Because Washington had built its expectations on old assumptions. For decades, India valued its relationship with America as a crucial pillar in its global strategy. The U.S. believed that this dependence would keep India in line. In their view, India would not dare risk economic ties, military cooperation, or diplomatic support. But what they failed to see was how much India had changed. Over the years, India had grown into a power capable of making its own decisions. Its economy was stronger, its global alliances more diverse, and its confidence more pronounced. The refusal was therefore not reckless. It was calculated. India knew the risks of saying no to America, but it also knew the greater risk of surrendering control of its policies to outside demands. By choosing independence over convenience, India showed that self-respect outweighed short-term benefits. This clarity stunned Washington because it had grown accustomed to nations caving under pressure. Instead, India displayed the rare courage to hold its ground. The shock ran deeper because it was not just about one phone call or one issue. It was about the collapse of an old mindset. For the U.S., the ability to pressure allies and partners had been a reliable tool. It had worked in the past with nations across the globe. Yet here was India, refusing to play by those rules. It broke the illusion that America's word was final, and in doing so, it forced the world to recognize a new reality. What made Modi's response even more significant was its subtlety. There was no loud rejection, no hostile rhetoric, only a quiet, firm refusal to compromise the country's interests. That quietness unsettled Washington even more because it showed strength without aggression. It proved that power is not always about raising your voice. Sometimes it is about refusing to be moved. The refusal also revealed a deeper truth. Respect cannot be demanded through threats. For a partnership to last, it must be built on equality, not fear. Washington's shock was the shock of realizing that India no longer saw itself as the weaker side of the relationship. Instead, it saw itself as an equal partner willing to cooperate, but unwilling to be controlled. This was a turning point in how the world viewed India. Suddenly, other nations saw that it was possible to resist and still stand tall. They saw that courage, when backed by principle, could shift the dynamics of power. And for Washington, the shock was not just about losing control over India's decision. It was about losing the comfort of knowing that pressure would always work. That comfort was gone, replaced by uncertainty. India's bold stand shattered assumptions that had been in place for decades. By refusing to bend, it proved that respect is earned, not imposed. By holding firm, it showed that even the strongest nations must reconsider their strategies. And by shocking the U.S., it demonstrated that the age of unquestioned obedience was coming to an end. The energy angle lay at the very core of this confrontation. It wasn't just about politics, it wasn't just about diplomacy, it was about oil, the lifeline of every modern economy. Energy drives growth, fuels industries, and keeps a nation moving forward. For decades, the United States had treated oil as a weapon of influence. By controlling access, prices, and partnerships, Washington shaped the decisions of other countries. When the pressure came, it came with a demand. Cut ties, stop your purchases, and follow our line. But this time, the response was different. India didn't bend. It didn't allow its lifeline to be dictated by another capital. Instead, it chose its own path. The decision was not impulsive. India knew exactly what was at stake. On one hand, there was the risk of angering Washington, a nation still seen by many as the world's superpower. On the other hand, there was the risk of slowing down its own growth, crippling its industries, and placing its people in a vulnerable position. The choice was clear: protect national interests first. Energy security mattered more than pleasing another country's demands. By refusing to cut off essential supplies, India was declaring that its development could not be held hostage by external pressure. This was a bold assertion of sovereignty. Nations across the world had long been forced to adapt their energy strategies to the wishes of more powerful countries. They accepted restrictions even when those restrictions hurt their economies because they feared the consequences of defiance. But India broke that pattern. It showed that energy decisions would be made in New Delhi, not in Washington. That simple refusal carried a weight far greater than numbers on an oil trade balance. It was a declaration of independence in the most practical sense. For the United States, this was a jolt. Its pressure tactics had succeeded many times before. Smaller nations, dependent on financial aid or security ties, had quietly complied. But India was not small. It was not weak. Its sheer size, its growing economy, and its strategic importance gave it the leverage to resist. Washington underestimated how determined India was to keep control over its energy future. And in doing so, it exposed a larger truth. The balance of power in the world was no longer one-sided. Breaking old patterns, India's refusal became a symbol of a new order taking shape. The world had long been divided between those who made the rules and those who followed them. But with this decision, India was no longer in the role of a follower. It was acting as an equal power, willing to negotiate, but unwilling to be dictated to. The energy angle became more than a policy decision. It became a statement of identity. What made the move even more significant was the ripple effect it created. Other nations watching closely began to see possibilities they had not considered before. If India could resist, why couldn't they? If India could secure energy on its own terms, Why should they settle for less? Slowly, the refusal began to inspire a shift in thinking. It planted the seed of a world where countries acted based on their interests, not just on fear of punishment. The clash over oil highlighted the fragility of the old system. For too long, energy had been a tool of coercion. Prices were manipulated, sanctions were imposed, and access was restricted, all to maintain dominance. But by choosing a different path, India cracked the foundation of that system. It made clear that access to energy should be a matter of survival and growth, not a bargaining chip in global politics. And as India charted its own path, it became evident that this was more than a single act of defiance. It was part of a broader transformation. The refusal to give in signaled that the world was becoming multipolar. No single nation could dictate terms unchallenged anymore. India's energy decision was proof that the future belonged to those who dared to break old patterns and build new ones. This moment redefined how power was measured. It was not about who shouted the loudest or threatened the hardest. It was about who could make independent choices and stand by them. By holding firm on the energy angle, India showed that true strength lies in self-reliance and courage. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not just about borders. It is about the power to decide your future without waiting for someone else's permission. Trump's dilemma became clear the moment the refusal reached his desk. He was a man used to getting results through force, through sharp words, through threats that shook other leaders into submission. But this time, the formula didn't work. The warnings had been issued. The pressure had been applied, and yet India stood unmoved. It was a problem no one in Washington had anticipated. Because India was not just another country, it was too big, too important, too central to global trade and security to be bullied into compliance. Any further pressure risked backfiring, and that left Trump in a corner he wasn't used to. The dilemma was not just political, it was strategic. How do you handle a nation that refuses your demands, yet one you cannot afford to alienate? The United States had invested years into building a partnership with India, seeing it as a counterweight in Asia. Yet here was that very partner saying no, calmly and firmly. Trump had to choose between doubling down on threats, which risked damaging long-term ties, or stepping back, which would make him look weak. Either option carried costs, and that made the refusal even more powerful. In the past, threats from Washington had been enough to bend governments across the world. Military aid could be suspended, trade barriers could be raised, sanctions could cripple economies. But none of those levers carried the same weight against India. The size of its economy, the scale of its market, and its growing influence meant that punishing India would hurt the United States as well. Trump realized that the usual playbook had no easy answer here. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, and Washington was no longer the unquestioned master of the game. This was a humbling lesson for America's leadership. They had grown accustomed to seeing smaller nations scramble to avoid punishment. But India's refusal revealed something deeper. The world had changed. It was no longer a landscape of one dominant power dictating to all others. Instead, it was becoming a stage of equals, where even the strongest had to listen if they wanted cooperation. Trump's dilemma was the visible sign of that transition. And while Washington struggled with how to respond, India's message to the world was already spreading. By rejecting pressure, India showed every other nation that it was possible to stand firm. That defiance didn't have to mean isolation. That resistance didn't have to mean destruction. Instead, it could command respect. The message was simple but powerful. Even the strongest must respect you when you refuse to compromise your dignity. This message resonated far beyond the immediate crisis. Leaders in other parts of the world saw in India's action a mirror of their own struggles. Many had long felt trapped between doing what was right for their people and bowing to external pressure. India's stand proved that there was another way, that courage, backed by careful calculation, could shift the balance, that saying no could actually strengthen a nation's position instead of weakening it. The symbolism was just as important as the reality. India didn't scream its defiance, it simply refused. That quiet strength became a model. It was not about aggression, it was about principle. It was about knowing your worth and not being shaken by the weight of someone else's threats. That kind of example can ripple across borders, inspiring not just governments but individuals to rethink how they respond to power. For Trump, the dilemma never truly ended. He could not claim victory, nor could he ignore the refusal. He had to adjust, recalibrate, and recognize India's growing autonomy. And for the rest of the world, the moment marked a shift in perception. The United States was still powerful, but it was no longer untouchable. Its word was no longer final. Respect could no longer be forced. It had to be earned. India's message to the world was unmistakable. Stand firm and you can't be ignored. Stand tall, and even giants must treat you as an equal. It was a lesson written not in speeches, but in action. A lesson that changed the way nations saw themselves in the global order. And it all began with one simple, unshakable refusal. The blind side effect unfolded quietly, but its impact was enormous. By the time the United States fully grasped what had happened, it was already too late. The call had been made, the pressure had been applied, but India had moved on its own terms. Decisions were taken, agreements were secured, and alliances were strengthened before Washington could react. The refusal was not just a moment of resistance. It was a strategic move that caught the world's most powerful nation off guard. America had been blindsided, and that was perhaps the most significant part of the story. The reason it stung so deeply was because Washington had assumed it was in control of the timing, the narrative, and the outcome. For decades, the pattern had been predictable. Apply pressure, issue threats, and watch the other side fold. But this time, when the United States leaned in, it found that the game had already moved past its hands. India had made its choice without waiting for approval, and that independence was what shifted the balance. The refusal was not defensive. It was proactive. By acting before the U.S. could escalate, India turned the tables, leaving Washington scrambling to catch up. This blindsiding was not just a diplomatic inconvenience. It was a symbolic blow. It proved that the United States no longer had the monopoly on control. It showed that even the most powerful nation could be outmaneuvered by quiet confidence and quick decisions. The strength of the moment was not in loud defiance, but in the subtle way India acted first and forced the U.S. to respond second. In power politics, that sequence matters. Whoever acts first shapes the field, and India had seized that opportunity. As news of the refusal spread, the world reacted with a mix of surprise, admiration, and curiosity. Many countries had been quietly watching, wondering if it was even possible to resist American pressure without suffering devastating consequences. For years, the fear of sanctions or isolation had kept them in line, but now they saw something different. India had not crumbled. It had not been destroyed. Instead, it stood taller, more respected, and more self-assured. That changed the perception of what was possible. The reaction was particularly strong among nations that had long felt trapped by dependency. Smaller economies, often forced into making choices against their interests, saw in India's action a new kind of roadmap. If a country could secure its independence while maintaining its growth, perhaps they too could rethink their strategies. India's boldness gave them permission to imagine alternatives. It was as if one act of resistance had cracked open a door that had been locked for decades. For Washington, this was unsettling. The U.S. had relied on the predictability of compliance to maintain its influence. If one country could refuse and still thrive, what would stop others from trying? That question became the quiet fear circulating through corridors of power. Because once a precedent is set, it becomes harder to enforce the old rules. India's refusal was not just a single act, it was an example that others could follow. The balance of power began to look different after this. No longer was it about one nation holding the strings while others danced. It was becoming a world where multiple voices demanded to be heard, where decisions were made in more than one capital. India had shown that global politics could no longer be dictated by a single hand. Instead, they would be shaped by those willing to stand firm, even when the stakes were high. And the world noticed something else too. India's refusal was not reckless. It was measured, deliberate, and rooted in long-term strategy. That made it even more compelling. It wasn't the rash act of a nation gambling with its future. It was the steady action of a power that understood its own weight. That difference mattered because it turned admiration into respect. Other countries didn't just see defiance, they saw leadership. The blind side effect thus became more than a momentary embarrassment for the United States. It was a signal that the old playbook was losing its power. The very act of refusing, done calmly and decisively, reshaped how the world viewed both India and America. And as nations absorbed this shift, one realization spread quickly. If India could resist, then so could they. The balance of power was no longer fixed. It was moving, evolving, and tilting toward a future where strength came not from control but from independence. The universal takeaway from this moment goes far beyond politics or international strategy. At its core, it is a lesson about life, dignity, and self-worth. When you know your value, no threat can control you. When you stand firm in what you believe, no amount of pressure can bend you. This principle is as true for nations as it is for individuals. The refusal to bow down is not just about power, it is about self-respect, the foundation of all strength. Think about it on a personal level. How often do people give in to demands, not because they agree, but because they fear the consequences of saying no? Fear becomes a weapon, just like sanctions or threats in global politics. And just as countries weaken themselves by surrendering to pressure, individuals weaken their character when they compromise their values to please others. But the moment you decide that your dignity is not for sale, everything changes. Suddenly, the threats lose their grip and the fear loses its power. India's stand is a reminder that self-worth is the strongest shield against manipulation. The U.S. tried to use pressure, believing that fear of losing a partnership would force submission. But India's response showed that when you are confident in your position, blackmail has no effect. This principle applies in relationships, in business, and in everyday life. When you define your boundaries, no one else gets to dictate them. The lesson also lies in calmness. Notice how the refusal was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and unwavering. That is exactly how strength should look in life. True confidence doesn't need to shout, it simply refuses to move. When someone tries to manipulate you, silence can be more powerful than anger. A calm refusal carries more weight than a desperate argument. It shows that your decisions come from clarity, not from fear. This universal truth also reveals something important: the power of choice. Everyone has the ability to say no, but not everyone believes they can. People give away their freedom because they underestimate themselves. Nations do the same. But the moment you realize that your future depends on your own decisions, not someone else's approval, you reclaim your power. That's what India did on the global stage. And it's what individuals must do in their own lives. Knowing your worth is not arrogance, it's awareness. It doesn't mean rejecting cooperation or relationships. It means refusing to let those relationships define your value. India did not reject the idea of working with America. It simply refused to let that partnership come at the cost of independence. In the same way in life, you can value others, respect others, and still refuse to compromise your dignity. That balance is where true strength lies. The danger of giving in to pressure is not just immediate, it's long term. Once you accept blackmail, once you allow threats to control you, it rarely ends there. The demands continue, the pressure grows, and your independence shrinks. Many nations have fallen into this trap. Many individuals do too. That's why standing firm at the beginning is so important. It sets the tone. It tells the other side that their tactics will not work here. This is why the refusal became more than a diplomatic moment. It became a lesson in personal power. The message is clear. Never trade your dignity for comfort. Never sacrifice your principles for short-term gains, because in the end, the cost is always greater than the reward. India chose a harder path in the short run, but in doing so, it secured greater respect in the long run. That is the same pattern in life. The easy way out often weakens you, but the harder choice strengthens you forever. The universal takeaway is simple yet profound. Whether you are a nation or an individual, the rule is the same. When you know your worth, no one can blackmail you. When you stand tall, no one can push you down. And when you refuse to be controlled by fear, you open the door to true freedom. This is not just about politics. It is about life itself. India's stand was not just a one-time event. It was not a single spark that burned out. It was the start of something bigger, the rewriting of global rules. For decades, the world was shaped by those who thought they held all the cards. But when India refused to bow, it changed the script. It showed that power is not about threats or pressure, it's about conviction, about knowing your worth, about choosing your own path even when the world tells you to kneel. This moment is more than politics. It's a reminder for all of us. Strength is built in silence, but it is revealed when tested. The world saw it. Other nations noticed, and now history is being written in a different language, the language of courage. One decision can shift everything. One refusal can shake the strongest hands. One stand can inspire millions. And that's the lesson. Never underestimate the power of standing firm when everything pushes you to give in. If this message spoke to you, if it opened your eyes to the importance of strength and conviction, then don't stop here. Like this video, share it with others who need to hear it. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and motivational speeches. Because the world is changing, and together we can learn how to rise with it.